History Entertainment brings you a series on the entire history of the United States, including every president and major event over the past 250 years. And it all starts right here, today, as we uncover the events that led up to 1776. It is a story of impossible odds, of violent conflict and soaring ideals, from a fragile experiment in democracy to the most powerful nation on earth. This is the story of us. This is the history of the United States. Before it was America, it was a desolate, frozen bridge connecting two continents. During the last ice age, massive glaciers locked up the world's water, lowering sea levels and revealing a wide, grassy steppe between Siberia and Alaska. Small bands of nomadic hunters, likely following herds of mammoth and bison, crossed over. They didn't know they were stepping into a new world. They were just surviving. Evidence of their arrival is small, sharp, and deadly. We call them Clovis points. These beautifully crafted stone spear tips were found embedded in the bones of extinct giants across the continent. They prove that the first Americans weren't just here. They were master hunters and skilled craftsmen who rapidly adapted to this new, dangerous environment. The North America they encountered was a land of monsters. Massive woolly mammoths, mastodons, and saber-toothed cats roamed spruce forests and open plains. But within a few thousand years of human arrival, combined with a warming climate, these titans vanished forever, forcing the people here to completely reinvent their way of life. As the big game disappeared, agriculture took root. In many regions, indigenous communities developed complex, sustainable farming. The most famous was the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash planted together. The corn provided a structure for the beans to climb, while the large squash leaves shaded the soil, keeping it moist. It was nutritional and agricultural genius. Long before European contact, massive cities rose along the Mississippi River. The greatest was Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis. At its peak around the year 1100, it had a population roughly equal to London's at the same time. Dominated by a colossal earthen pyramid, it was a bustling, sophisticated center of trade and religion. Further east, 5 distinct nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, ended generations of warfare to form the Iroquois Confederacy. They created a sophisticated constitution known as the Great Law of Peace, establishing a representative council that predated the U.S. Constitution by centuries. In the arid Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built architectural marvels into the sides of canyons. Places like Mesa Verde were complex stone apartment blocks constructed high in cliff alcoves, accessible only by ladders and toeholds. They were defensive, communal, and engineered to survive in a harsh desert environment. Then, in 1492, two worlds that had been separated for millennia collided. Christopher Columbus, searching for Asia, stumbled upon the Bahamas. The moment his men stepped off that rowboat, everything changed. It was the beginning of the end for millions of indigenous people, and the start of a massive, violent, global rearrangement. This contact triggered the Columbian Exchange, a massive transfer of biology across the ocean. Europe got calorie-rich crops like potatoes, corn, and tomatoes, which exploded their populations. The Americas got horses, pigs, and guns. But Europe also sent something else devastating: invisible killers like smallpox and influenza, to which native people had zero immunity. Fueled by dreams of gold, Spanish conquistadors like Hernando de Soto carved brutal paths through the American Southeast in the 1540s. Their armored columns trudged through humid swamps, bringing violence, enslavement, and disease to the complex chiefdoms they encountered, destabilizing entire regions long before English settlers ever arrived. The Spanish also established the first permanent European settlement in what is now the United States, St. Augustine in Florida, founded in 1565. Decades before Jamestown, the Spanish were building massive stone fortresses like the Castillo de San Marcos to protect their treasure fleets from pirates and rival nations. England's first attempts at colonization were disasters. In 1587, over 100 settlers landed on Roanoke Island off North Carolina. Their governor left for supplies and returned 3 years later to find nothing. The site was abandoned, overgrown, and the word Croatoan was carved into a wooden post. Their fate remains an American mystery. In 1607, the English tried again. 3 small ships sailed up a river in Virginia and established Jamestown. It was a terrible location, a swampy peninsula infested with malaria-carrying mosquitoes and surrounded by a powerful indigenous empire. They came looking for gold. Instead, they found misery and death. The winter of 1609 was the nadir. They called it the starving time. Trapped inside their fort by the Powhatan Indians and out of food, the settlers became desperate. They ate their horses, their boots, rats, and eventually some resorted to cannibalism. Out of nearly 500 settlers, only 60 survived till spring. Jamestown was saved not by gold, but by a leaf. John Rolfe began experimenting with a sweet strain of Spanish tobacco. It grew incredibly well in Virginia soil and became a sensation in England. Suddenly, the colony had a cash crop, a reason to exist. But this brown gold required immense amounts of labor to grow. In late August 1619, a profound shift occurred. A privateer ship docked at Point Comfort, Virginia. The captain traded 20 and odd captive Africans for food supplies. While their initial status was murky, this moment marked the beginning of African enslavement in English America, the original sin that would define the nation's economy and its deepest conflicts. That same year, something else momentous happened. In a small church in Jamestown, elected representatives from around the colony met for the first time. They called it the House of Burgesses. It was the first representative legislative assembly in the Americas, the tiny seed of self-government that would eventually grow into the United States Congress. Further north, a different kind of colony was beginning. A group of religious separatists, later called Pilgrims, fled England seeking to worship freely. Their journey across the Atlantic on the Mayflower was a nightmare. 66 days of brutal storms in a crowded, leaking ship, driven far off course from their intended destination in Virginia. Realizing they were landing outside English jurisdiction in what is now Massachusetts, chaos threatened to break out before they even stepped ashore. To maintain order, the men signed the Mayflower Compact, a simple agreement to create a civil body politic and abide by its laws. It was a radical idea. Government derived from the consent of the governed. Like Jamestown, Plymouth's first winter was a devastation. They arrived too late to plant crops. Half the company died of disease and exposure in the freezing New England cold. They buried their dead at night so the local indigenous people wouldn't see how quickly their numbers were dwindling. The survivors would have died if not for the Wampanoag people. Their leader, Massasoit, established a cautious alliance. Crucially, a man named Tisquantum, or Squanto, who spoke English because he'd been previously kidnapped by slavers, taught the Pilgrims how to survive in this new land, showing them how to use fish to fertilize the sandy soil for corn. The harvest of 1621 was successful enough to celebrate, but the first Thanksgiving wasn't just a happy family dinner. It was a tense, 3-day diplomatic summit between 50 vulnerable colonists and 90 Wampanoag warriors who arrived firing their guns in salute. It was a moment of peace, but one born of political necessity on both sides. 10 years later, a much larger group of Puritans arrived to found Boston. They weren't separatists. They wanted to purify the Church of England by example. Their leader, John Winthrop, famously declared, "We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." It was the beginning of the idea of American exceptionalism. As more English arrived, tensions with native tribes exploded. The Pequot War in Connecticut marked a shift toward total warfare. In 1637, Puritan militia and their native allies surrounded a Pequot village at Mystic and set it on fire, massacring hundreds of men, women, and children as they tried to escape the flames. The Puritans came for religious freedom, but only for themselves. When a brilliant minister named Roger Williams argued that the government shouldn't force religious belief and that colonists should pay Indians for land, he was banished into the winter wilderness. He survived to found Providence, Rhode Island, the first colony established specifically on the radical idea of separating church and state. While the English struggled, the Dutch were all about business. They established New Amsterdam on the tip of Manhattan Island. It was a chaotic, multicultural trading hub where 18 languages were spoken. To protect their investments from the English and Native Americans, they built a wooden wall on the northern edge of town, a street we literally still call Wall Street today. The English couldn't tolerate a rival power sitting right in the middle of their colonies. In 1664, 4 English frigates sailed into the harbor and demanded surrender. The Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, wanted to fight, but his own people refused. They surrendered without a single shot fired, and New Amsterdam was instantly renamed New York. By 1675, the peace between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag had shattered. Massasoit's son, Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, launched a desperate war to drive the colonists into the sea. It was the bloodiest conflict per capita in American history. When Metacom was finally killed, the English severed his head and displayed it on a pike in Plymouth for 20 years. A year later in Virginia, a different kind of war broke out. Poor frontier farmers and indentured servants felt the wealthy elite in Jamestown were ignoring their safety against native attacks. Led by Nathaniel Bacon, they marched on the capital and burned it to the ground. This terrified the ruling class, who began replacing troublesome white indentured servants with permanently enslaved Africans to prevent future uprisings. Pennsylvania was different. Founded by William Penn as a haven for Quakers, it was a holy experiment based on pacifism. Penn refused to build forts or bring an army. Instead, he met with the Lenape people unarmed and bought the land fair and square. For decades, it was the only colony where peace actually worked. But in Massachusetts, fear took over. In the bitterly cold winter of 1692, hysterical accusations of witchcraft tore Salem Village apart. It started with teenage girls having fits and ended with 20 people executed. It wasn't really about magic. It was about the deep anxiety of a society that felt it was losing control of its religion and its borders. By the 1700s, the colonies were booming, fueled by a human nightmare. The Middle Passage was the brutal journey across the Atlantic for enslaved Africans. Packed into shipholds like cargo, millions suffered unspeakable horrors. Those who survived the voyage arrived in a land that defined them as property, not people. Enslaved people didn't just accept this fate. In South Carolina, a group of men led by a localized leader named Jimmy seized weapons and marched south, beating drums and chanting "Liberty!" They were heading for Spanish Florida, where they were promised freedom. It was the largest slave uprising in the British colonies, and it resulted in even harsher codes to crush the human spirit. Before the revolution was political, it was spiritual. A wave of religious revival called the Great Awakening swept the colonies. Preachers like George Whitefield spoke to thousands in open fields, telling them they didn't need a church hierarchy to connect with God. It was a radical idea. If you could question the authority of the church, why couldn't you question the authority of the king? As war with France loomed, Benjamin Franklin tried to unite the colonies. He proposed the Albany Plan of Union, a grand council for mutual defense. He even drew a famous cartoon of a snake cut into pieces with the caption, "Join or die." But the colonies were too jealous of their own power to agree. They weren't Americans yet. They were just Virginians and New Yorkers. The spark that set the world on fire happened in the Pennsylvania wilderness. A 22-year-old Virginian named George Washington attacked a French patrol. It was a disaster. He was soon surrounded at a makeshift stockade called Fort Necessity and forced to surrender. This small skirmish triggered the 7 Years' War, the first true World War. The war turned at Quebec. British General James Wolfe launched a daring amphibious assault, scaling the cliffs of the Plains of Abraham under the cover of darkness. In the ensuing battle, both Wolfe and the French commander Montcalm were killed, but the British won. It was the end of the French Empire in North America. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 redrew the map. France was gone. Britain now owned everything east of the Mississippi. It should have been a moment of triumph, but the war had bankrupted the British Empire. To pay for it, Parliament decided it was time for the colonists to finally pay their share. To prevent more costly wars with Native Americans, King George III drew a line down the spine of the Appalachian Mountains. He forbade any settlement west of it. The colonists, who had just fought and died for that land, were furious. They felt betrayed. Thousands of them, including Washington, ignored the order and moved west anyway. Then came the taxes. First sugar, then the Stamp Act. It required a royal stamp on every piece of paper, legal documents, playing cards, newspapers. It wasn't the cost, it was the principle. For the first time, Parliament was taxing the colonies directly without their consent. The cry went up, "No taxation without representation." Resistance wasn't just polite debate. In Boston, a secret group called the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, used intimidation. They hung tax collectors in effigy, ransacked homes, and tarred and feathered loyalists. They were terrorists to the crown, but patriots to the cause. Tensions boiled over on a cold March night in 1770. A lone sentry was heckled by a crowd throwing snowballs and oysters. More soldiers arrived. Confusion. A musket flashed. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead, including Crispus Attucks, a black sailor. Paul Revere's engraving of the event turned a chaotic riot into a bloody massacre. The anger spread beyond Boston. In Rhode Island, when a hated British customs schooner, the Gaspee, ran aground pursuing smugglers, locals didn't help. They rowed out at night, shot the captain, and burned the ship to the waterline. It was an act of open war against the Royal Navy. Parliament repealed most taxes, but kept the one on tea, just to prove they could. In December 1773, the Sons of Liberty responded. Thinly disguised as Mohawk Indians, they boarded 3 ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. It wasn't a riot. It was a calculated, quiet destruction of property worth millions today. King George was done being patient. He passed the coercive acts. Columnists called them intolerable. He closed Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for, effectively starving the city, and replaced the civilian government with a military general. Boston was now an occupied city under martial law. The king hoped to isolate Massachusetts, but he accidentally united them. 12 colonies sent delegates to Philadelphia. For the first time, rivals like George Washington, John Adams, and Patrick Henry sat in the same room. Henry declared, "The distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American." April 1775. British troops marched out of Boston to seize gunpowder in Concord, but the Patriots were watching. 2 lanterns hung in the old North Church steeple signaled they were coming by sea. Paul Revere and other riders galloped into the darkness, not shouting, "The British are coming," everyone was British, but "The regulars are out." Dawn at Lexington Green. A standoff between 70 farmers and 700 professional soldiers. A shot rang out, no one knows who fired it, and the war began. The British pushed to Concord but were swarmed by militia on the march back. From behind every stone wall and tree, the colonists fired, turning the British retreat into a bloody rout. 2 months later, the British tried to break the siege of Boston at Bunker Hill. They launched 3 suicidal assaults up the hill. The colonists, low on ammo, were told, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The British took the hill, but they lost over 1,000 men. They won the ground, but they lost the illusion that this would be easy. Amazingly, even after the shooting started, most colonists didn't want independence. They sent the Olive Branch petition to London, begging for peace and loyalty to the king. George III refused to even read it. He declared the colonies in open and avowed rebellion. There was no turning back now. In January 1776, a failed corset maker named Thomas Paine published a pamphlet called Common Sense. It argued, in plain language, that it was ridiculous for an island to rule a continent. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Suddenly, independence wasn't a radical idea, it was the only logical choice. June 1776. The Continental Congress appointed a committee to explain to the world why they were breaking away. The task of writing fell to the quiet 33-year-old Thomas Jefferson. In a rented room in Philadelphia, wrestling with the heat and his own contradictions, he drafted the words that would change history. On July 4th, the delegates approved the document. Signing it wasn't a ceremony, it was a death warrant. If they lost, every man in that room would be hanged for treason. As they affixed their names to the Declaration of Independence, they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. The United States was born. History isn't just the past, it's the map to our future. Join us next time as the American story continues.